Children growing up near Milford heard the story first as a warning. Elders spoke of a time when fear ruled the roads, when a single man's displeasure could unravel entire families. They spoke of girls who never returned home the same, of cottages reduced to rubble by daylight, of winter survived on nettles and hope. Only later did they speak of Cratlack Wood, of the narrow road, of the moment when the balance shifted. The story always ended the same way. After that day, things were different. Outside Donegal, the assassination entered a broader national narrative. Irish nationalists cited it as evidence that tyranny bred resistance more surely than any ideology. British commentators, less sympathetic, framed it as a descent into savagery. Yet even among critics, an uncomfortable concession emerged. The Earl of Leitrim had been uniquely despised. His death, unlike other acts of violence, provoked no backlash among the population he had ruled. The absence of mourning spoke louder than any justification. Scholars examining estate records later confirmed what tenants had long claimed. Clements' land showed higher eviction rates, lower investment, and worse living conditions than nearly any comparable estate in Ireland. Correspondence revealed a man obsessed with control, dismissive of reform, and convinced that fear was the only effective tool of governance. His letters displayed neither regret nor restraint. They offered context, if not absolution. The legal system, too, bore lasting scars from the case. The Donegal investigation became a textbook example of the limits of policing without consent. Training manuals referenced it obliquely, emphasizing community relations and intelligence gathering. The lesson was clear. Authority enforced solely through power collapses when cooperation is withdrawn. The constabulary could flood the countryside with men, but without information, they were blind. For the families who had suffered directly under the Earl's rule, the aftermath unfolded quietly. Some reclaimed land they had once worked, now under new arrangements. Others emigrated, carrying the story overseas to Scotland, America, and Canada. In immigrant communities, the tale was retold alongside famine memories, reinforcing a shared understanding of why so many had left. The Earl of Leitrim became a symbol, shorthand for an entire system that had failed its people. Milford House itself stood as a physical reminder of impermanence. Once meticulously maintained, it deteriorated rapidly after Clements' death. Windows shattered in storms. Roof tiles slipped and fell. Ivy crept steadily across stone walls. No one rushed to restore it. Locals avoided the grounds, not out of superstition alone, but from a desire to let the past settle undisturbed. Eventually, the house was abandoned entirely, a silent monument to authority stripped of relevance. Visitors who passed the ruins in later years often asked what had happened there. The answers were brief. A bad man lived here. That was usually enough. The full story was reserved for those who belonged, for those who understood the weight of silence and the value of restraint. The community had learned that not every truth needed public airing to remain true. Historians attempting to reconstruct the identities of the assassins encountered a consistent barrier. Names surfaced in private letters, marginal notes, and oral accounts, but never with sufficient certainty to satisfy academic standards. This ambiguity frustrated some researchers, but others recognized it as part of the event's meaning. The killers had been absorbed into the community they defended. Individual identity mattered less than collective action. What distinguished the assassination from later political violence was its specificity. This was not an attack on a symbol chosen abstractly. It was directed at a man whose actions were known intimately by those around him. The grievance was personal, cumulative, and local. There were no manifestos, no declarations, no attempt to inspire imitation. The act spoke only to its immediate context, and perhaps that was why it resonated so deeply. Alongside sexual predation ran economic brutality of a kind that affected every tenant regardless of age or gender. Clements' estate management was infamous even by the standards of the time. He invested nothing in improvements, extracted every possible penny, and showed open contempt for those who worked his land. Government inspectors described housing on his estates as unfit for human habitation, barely weatherproof huts with earthen floors, no furniture, no heat, and insufficient food. His response to such criticism was blunt and public. If they did not like it, they could leave. Leaving, of course, meant starvation. The famine had taught that lesson brutally. Rent collection days were exercises in terror. The Earl arrived personally, accompanied by his clerk, his driver, armed retainers, and police. Tenants lined up before his carriage. Those who could not produce the full rent were evicted immediately. There was no grace period, no allowance for illness, crop failure, or death. Irish law required certain procedures, and Clements followed them meticulously in form, while violating their spirit entirely. Police presence made the eviction technically legal. Then hired men tore roofs from cottages and smashed walls, so families could not return after dark. Dispossessed tenants gathered their few belongings and wandered the roads. Many ended up in workhouses where families were separated and conditions deliberately harsh to discourage dependence. Others disappeared into the anonymous mass of the rural poor, dying from exposure, disease, or hunger. Over decades, Clements evicted hundreds of families. Entire townlands emptied. Fields reverted to wilderness. Sheep replaced people. The first serious attempt on the Earl's life came in February 1871. Shots rang out from behind a stone wall as his carriage passed. 2 bullets struck the vehicle. One passed through the seat where he had been sitting moments earlier. He survived only because he had bent down to retrieve something from the floor. The constabulary launched an investigation and found nothing. In a populated countryside, no witnesses came forward. The message was unmistakable. Fear was turning into resistance. Clements responded predictably. He hired more guards, evicted families he suspected of harboring attackers, and began carrying a pistol, but he refused to retreat. If anything, his behavior became more aggressive, as though daring someone to try again. In 1872, an incident occurred that would later take on grim significance. 17-year-old Margaret McLoone was summoned to Milford House to discuss her father's overdue rent. She returned home at dusk, silent and withdrawn. That night, she disappeared. Her body was found days later in Mulroy Bay. The death was ruled accidental. No one believed it. Margaret's father became a changed man. He stared endlessly toward Milford House before eventually emigrating, unable to remain near the man responsible for his daughter's destruction. The lesson was clear. Direct confrontation was futile. The system protected the Earl completely. Throughout the mid-1870s, Clements intensified evictions and consolidated his lands. But resistance was changing shape. Fenian influence spread quietly among young men drilling in secret. Anonymous threats arrived. Clements dismissed them publicly, but privately began varying his routes and increasing security. By the spring of 1878, everyone understood that something was coming. The Earl himself knew it. He simply did not know when or from where. On the morning of April 2nd, his carriage left Milford House as it had countless times before. He would not return alive. Part 2 of 4, exactly 2,000 words. The road north from Milford House wound through quiet farmland and narrow lanes bordered by stone walls darkened with age and moss. On the morning of April 2nd, 1878, the countryside appeared calm. A few farmers worked their fields. Children walked distant paths toward school. Nothing in the air suggested that violence was moments away. Inside the carriage sat William Sydney Clements, 3rd Earl of Leitrim, accompanied by his clerk, Charles Buchanan, and his driver, a man known locally as McKim. The Earl was 72 years old. He had ruled his estates for decades without meaningful challenge, and despite the threats he had received, habit and arrogance carried him forward. As the carriage approached a wooded stretch near Cratlack Wood, the road narrowed sharply. Stone walls rose on either side, closing the path and limiting escape. Trees overhung the road, their branches forming a shadowed corridor. It was a place well known to locals, a natural choke point where travelers slowed and visibility dropped. For men planning an ambush, it was ideal. 3 figures emerged suddenly from behind the wall. They wore long coats and had scarves drawn up over their faces. 2 carried shotguns. The 3rd held a pistol. There were no shouted warnings, no demands for money, no hesitation. They opened fire immediately. The first blast struck McKim squarely in the chest. He toppled from the driver's seat and fell heavily into the road. The horses reared and screamed, trapped between stone walls with nowhere to run. Charles Buchanan attempted to leave the carriage, perhaps believing he could reason with the attackers or simply flee. He barely managed to step down before the second shotgun blast struck him at close range. He collapsed across the carriage steps, mortally wounded, blood pooling beneath him. The violence unfolded in seconds. William Sydney Clements emerged next, finally grasping the reality of what was happening. He reached into his coat for the pistol he had begun carrying years earlier. His movements were slow, clumsy with shock and age. The third assailant raised his weapon and fired twice. Both bullets struck the Earl in the chest. Clements staggered backward, clutching his torso, disbelief written across his face. The attackers were not finished. One stepped forward holding a heavy object, variously described later as a stone or a wooden club. He brought it down repeatedly upon the Earl's head. Blow after blow fell with deliberate force, until Clements collapsed face first into the mud. His skull fractured beneath the assault. The men paused briefly, ensuring their work was complete, then turned and ran toward the cover of Cratlack Wood. Within moments, they were gone. The entire attack lasted less than 3 minutes. A farmer named Michael Gallagher was working a field roughly 200 yards away. He heard the gunfire but did not immediately investigate. In rural Donegal, gunshots were not uncommon. People hunted rabbits, scared foxes from livestock, or fired warning shots. It was only when Gallagher noticed the horses still rearing violently in their harnesses, the carriage skewed across the road, that concern took hold. He approached cautiously, heart pounding. What he discovered horrified him. 3 men lay dead or die around the carriage. Blood soaked into the dirt of the road. The horses trembled with terror, eyes wide and rolling. Gallagher immediately understood that nothing could be done. He turned and ran to the nearest cottage to raise the alarm. Within an hour, the road was crowded with people. Constables arrived from nearby barracks, attempting to secure the scene and organize a search. A doctor was summoned from Milford to pronounce the deaths. Local magistrates appeared, beginning the grim process of documentation. The bodies presented a brutal tableau. McKim had been shot in the back, killed while trying to flee. Buchanan's wounds were catastrophic, his arm nearly severed. But it was the Earl who bore the marks of personal hatred. In addition to the gunshot wounds, his skull was shattered in multiple places. His face was scarcely recognizable. The carriage itself told an important story. Clements' possessions remained untouched. His gold watch hung from its chain. His wallet, containing a considerable sum of cash, was still in his pocket. His expensive coat lay where it had fallen. This had not been a robbery gone wrong. It was a deliberate execution. Dr. Thomas Swinburne, who examined the bodies, noted in his report that the Earl had sustained 2 gunshot wounds to the chest, either of which would have been fatal. The cranial injuries, he wrote, indicated repeated blows delivered with extreme force. The ferocity of the attack suggested profound personal animosity. This was not the work of opportunistic criminals, but of men driven by deep hatred. News of the assassination spread rapidly through County Donegal. The reaction was unlike anything authorities had anticipated. There was no collective shock, no mourning. Instead, people celebrated openly. In the town of Milford, crowds gathered. Someone produced a fiddle. Dancing began in the streets. In public houses, men bought round for strangers, raising glasses to unknown killers. One voice was heard to say, "They have done God's work today." Across the Earl's former estates, similar scenes unfolded. In villages hollowed out by evictions, where daughters had vanished and families had been broken, the news was received with open joy. An elderly woman whose family had been expelled years earlier fell to her knees and offered prayers of thanksgiving. For those who had lived under Clements' rule, the event felt less like a crime and more like deliverance. The response from Dublin and London could not have been more different. Newspapers screamed of lawlessness and barbarity. The Lord Lieutenant of Ireland condemned the killing as a heinous act of terrorism against a peer of the realm. A reward of £10,000 was offered for information leading to the capture of the assassins, a staggering sum equal to years of income for a working family. Yet in Donegal, silence descended. The Royal Irish Constabulary launched what became the largest investigation in the region's history. Dozens of officers were deployed. Hundreds of witnesses were interviewed. Cottages and barns were searched across the countryside. Immunity was offered to anyone willing to provide information. Nothing emerged. Farmers who had been working within sight of the ambush claimed to have seen and heard nothing of value. The wall of silence proved absolute. Investigators identified several suspects based on motive and reputation. Michael McKelvey, a tenant evicted years earlier. Neil Shields, known as a Fenian sympathizer. Michael Harity, whose sister had served at Milford House and left under troubling circumstances. All three were arrested and questioned intensively. None confessed. No evidence placed them at the scene. After weeks of detention, they were released. The investigation dragged on for months, then years, without progress. The reward remained unclaimed. The case officially remained open, but in practice it was dead. Authorities understood the truth, even if they could not prove it. The community had chosen collective silence. Hundreds knew who had killed the Earl, and not one would speak. It was a shared decision that justice had been done. Stories circulated quietly in the years that followed. Some claimed the assassins were Fenian revolutionaries striking against British rule. Others said they were ordinary tenants driven beyond endurance. Some believed the killers fled to America. Others insisted they remained in Donegal, living ordinary lives under protection of their neighbors. One persistent rumor spoke of a young woman whose abuse had finally sparked vengeance. The details varied, but the meaning remained constant. This killing was about more than land. It was about dignity and protection denied. In death, William Sydney Clements lost the power he had wielded so absolutely in life. But the consequences of his assassination were only beginning to unfold. In the weeks following the assassination, the British administration faced a deeply uncomfortable reality. A peer of the realm had been murdered in broad daylight, yet the machinery of empire was powerless to secure a single conviction. The silence in Donegal was not merely fear-driven. It was disciplined, communal, and resolute. Officials accustomed to deference encountered something far more dangerous: moral refusal. The law existed on paper, but legitimacy had evaporated on the ground. The inquest into the deaths was held in Milford under heavy police guard. Jurors were drawn from the local population, many of whom had themselves lived under the Earl's authority. The proceedings were tense from the outset. Evidence was presented with clinical detachment. Doctors described wounds. Constables described the scene. The Crown attempted to frame the murders as a criminal conspiracy threatening public order. Yet when the jury retired, their decision was swift. They returned a verdict of willful murder by persons unknown. No further comment was offered. The court adjourned in uneasy silence. Privately, officials understood the verdict as a rebuke. It acknowledged the crime while denying the state any power to assign blame. Newspapers in London reacted with fury. Editorials demanded emergency powers, harsher policing, and the suspension of jury trials in rebellious districts. Ireland, they argued, had become ungovernable, but beneath the outrage lay a deeper anxiety. If a landlord as powerful as the Earl of Leitrim could be killed without consequence, then the authority of land ownership itself stood exposed. The assassination reverberated through the Anglo-Irish landlord class like a thunderclap. For generations, landlords had relied on distance, privilege, and protection of the state. Now, many realized that isolation cut both ways. Estates were vast, roads were lonely, and resentment was universal. Carriages that once rolled confidently now traveled with armed escorts. Some landlords relocated to England permanently. Others sold their holdings quietly, accepting financial loss in exchange for safety. The age of unquestioned dominance was ending. On the Leitrim estates themselves, the change was immediate. Clements had died without a direct heir prepared to assume his role in Donegal. His nephew inherited the title, but he had no desire to live in Milford House or continue his uncle's methods. Rent demands were reduced. Evictions slowed dramatically. In some areas, tenants were granted longer leases, an unthinkable concession only months earlier. The terror that had defined daily life began, slowly, to lift. Women who had lived in fear of summons to the big house spoke more freely. Stories long suppressed began to surface, shared cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. Accounts of coercion, assault, and intimidation followed familiar patterns. Each story reinforced the same conclusion. The violence inflicted upon the Earl had not arisen from rumor or exaggeration, but from accumulated harm inflicted over decades. The silence that had protected him in life had been shattered by his death. Clergy who had once avoided confrontation now preached sermons that hinted at moral reckoning. Without naming Clemens directly, they spoke of pharaohs brought low, of unjust rulers meeting divine judgment. Congregations understood the references. In Donegal, the killing entered oral tradition not as a crime, but as a turning point. Parents told their children that a line had been crossed and never uncrossed. Nationalist movements across Ireland seized upon the event as proof that resistance was possible. Fenian newspapers portrayed the assassination as an act of popular justice, a warning to tyrants. While official organizations denied involvement, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. The killing demonstrated that power backed solely by coercion was fragile. It also revealed the limits of British control when the population withdrew cooperation entirely. In London, the government attempted to restore confidence through legislation. New coercion acts expanded police powers, allowed for detention without trial, and increased surveillance in rural districts. But these measures addressed symptoms, not causes. Land hunger, poverty, and abuse remained unresolved. Each new law widened the gulf between ruler and ruled. The memory of the Earl of Leitrim became a reference point in debates over land reform. Reformers cited his estates as examples of what unchecked landlordism produced. Parliamentary inquiries referenced Donegal conditions repeatedly. While Clemens' defenders attempted to dismiss allegations as slander, the sheer volume of testimony undermined their credibility. The dead could not answer, and the living no longer feared contradiction. For the families of those killed alongside the Earl, the outcome was more complicated. McKim's relatives received little sympathy. He was remembered as a servant of oppression, a man who drove evicted families from their homes. Buchanan, the clerk, fared little better in public memory. Though not personally accused of violence, he had enforced rent demands with relentless efficiency. In Donegal's moral calculus, proximity to power carried responsibility. Years passed, and the case slipped into the background of official records. Files gathered dust. The reward was eventually withdrawn. Younger constables knew the assassination only as a cautionary tale, something their predecessors spoke of quietly. Yet in Donegal, the story remained alive, retold with careful consistency. Names were rarely spoken aloud. The identities of the killers were protected not by secrecy alone, but by collective agreement that some truths served no purpose when exposed. The broader transformation of Ireland accelerated in the decades that followed. The Land League mobilized tenants nationwide, demanding fair rents, fixity of tenure, and free sale of leases. Boycotts replaced bullets as weapons of resistance, but the memory of Donegal lingered as an unspoken reminder of what could happen when peaceful methods failed. Landlords, sensing the shift, negotiated rather than dictated. The balance of power, once absolute, began to tilt. By the early 20th century, the old order had largely collapsed. Estates were broken up. Tenants became owners. The big houses, once symbols of dominance, fell into decay or were abandoned entirely. Milford House itself eventually stood empty, its windows broken, its walls slowly reclaimed by weather and time. Locals avoided the grounds. Some said it was haunted. Others simply preferred not to disturb a place heavy with memory. Historians have debated the assassination of the Earl of Leitrim for generations. Some frame it as political violence, a precursor to later revolutionary acts. Others emphasize its social dimension, a spontaneous eruption of rural justice. Still others caution against romanticizing murder, regardless of motive. Each interpretation contains elements of truth, yet none fully captures the atmosphere of Donegal in 1878. To understand the event properly, one must abandon modern assumptions about law and morality. For the tenants of Milford, the law had never been neutral. It was an instrument wielded against them, enforced by men who answered to landlords rather than communities. Courts offered no refuge. Police inspired fear, not protection. In such a world, legality and justice diverged completely. The men who lay in wait at Cratlack did not see themselves as criminals. They believed they were acting where every other mechanism had failed. Whether history agrees with them is ultimately less important than understanding why their neighbors protected them afterward. Silence was not imposed. It was chosen. William Sydney Clements had lived convinced of his own untouchability. His title, wealth, and connections reinforced that belief daily. Yet power exercised without restraint accumulates resistance invisibly, like pressure beneath the earth. When release comes, it is sudden and violent. The Earl learned this too late. On a narrow road bordered by stone walls, he had passed countless times before. The assassination did not bring peace or solve Ireland's injustices overnight, but it altered expectations. It demonstrated that even the most entrenched authority could be challenged when legitimacy collapsed entirely. In that sense, the killing marked not only an end, but beginning. Part 44, exactly 2,000 words. In the decades after the assassination, memory did its quiet work, shaping the meaning of the event more powerfully than any official report. As generations passed, the killing of the third Earl of Leitrim ceased to exist merely as a crime recorded in dusty ledgers. It became a moral landmark, a story used to explain how cruelty, when sustained long enough, invites its own reckoning. In Donegal, history was not archived. It was remembered. April 2nd, 1878. Milford County, Donegal, Ireland. On a rain-soaked country road lies the body of William Sydney Clements, 3rd Earl of Leitrim, face down in the mud. 3 bullets have torn through his chest. His skull is crushed by repeated blows from a heavy object. A few yards behind him, his carriage stands abandoned, its door hanging open at an unnatural angle. Nearby lie 2 additional bodies, his clerk and his driver, both shot in the back while attempting to flee. Nothing has been taken. The Earl's gold watch still hangs from his waistcoat chain. His wallet remains in his coat pocket undisturbed. This was not a robbery. It was a killing plan with care and executed with cold precision, carried out in broad daylight on a public road. The local constabulary would later describe the scene as murder of the most shocking kind. But among the hundreds of tenant families who had lived under the Earl's rule, another word spread quietly from cottage to cottage: justice. Yet the truth behind the assassination was far more disturbing than either side could comfortably admit. To understand how a peer of the realm could be cut down so publicly, one must step backward into an Ireland gripped by hunger, fear, and absolute imbalance of power. Before we examine the forces that culminated in the Earl of Leitrim's death, make sure to subscribe to Hypnotic Histories and ring the notification bell so you never miss our explorations into history's darkest chapters. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. We value hearing from our community of listeners around the world. Ireland from the 1840s through the 1870s was a nation locked in continuous crisis. The Great Famine devastated the countryside, killing more than 1 million people and forcing another million to flee overseas. Entire villages vanished. Fields lay untended. Graveyards overflowed. Those who survived were left trapped within a social system that would have seemed archaic even centuries earlier. Protestant Anglo-Irish landlords, many of them absentee owners living comfortably in England or Dublin, controlled vast estates worked by Catholic Irish tenants who possessed no legal rights, no security of tenure, and no realistic path out of poverty. This was a society where ownership conferred authority approaching absolute power. County Donegal occupied the remote northwest corner of Ireland, a region of harsh beauty, rugged coastline, and grinding deprivation. It was isolated from the centers of administration and oversight, and this isolation allowed local power to operate largely unchecked. In and around the townlands near Milford, William Sydney Clements ruled as undisputed master. He was the 3rd Earl of Leitrim, a member of the House of Lords, and the owner of more than 90,000 acres spread across several Irish counties. But titles alone do not explain fear. From the beginning, Clements inspired something darker than mere resentment. Born in 1806 into immense privilege, he inherited his title at a young age. While many landlords adopted at least the outward language of paternal responsibility, Clements showed little interest in appearing benevolent. Contemporary accounts described him as imperious, vindictive, and utterly lacking mercy. One Dublin newspaper later wrote that his nature was so cruel and despotic it would have disgraced a Turkish pasha. Such language was not used lightly in Victorian journalism. Although his estates extended across Leitrim, Galway, and Donegal, It was in Donegal, far from political scrutiny, that his true character revealed itself without restraint. He maintained several residences, but increasingly favored Milford House, his Donegal seat. There, he moved among tenants like a feudal lord, demanding obedience and delivering punishment personally. His carriage became a symbol of dread. When it appeared on local roads, families fled indoors, bolted doors, and hid their daughters. Fear traveled faster than wheels. The Earl's reputation extended well beyond ruthless recollection. Whispers had circulated for years, passed quietly between kitchens and fields. A young woman summoned to Milford House to discuss overdue rent returned hours later, clothes torn, refusing to speak. A servant dismissed suddenly after becoming pregnant vanished into destitution. A tenant who confronted the Earl over unwanted attention toward his teenage daughter found his family evicted within days. Their cottage later burned to the ground. The pattern repeated with grim consistency. The victims were almost always young women from the poorest families. Some were domestic servants. Others were daughters of tenants, summoned under the pretense of estate business. Refusal meant ruin. In the rigid class structure of Victorian Ireland, these women had nowhere to turn. Local magistrates socialized with the Earl. Police depended on landlords for advancement. Even clergy moved carefully around a man of such wealth and influence. Accusations would be dismissed as slander, portrayed as desperate lies from peasants with ulterior motives. Silence became the only form of survival. Moral philosophers have long debated whether violence can ever be justified. The case of the Earl of Leitrim is frequently cited precisely because it resists easy categorization. Few mourned his death, many felt relief. Yet discomfort remains. The killing bypassed law entirely, replacing it with communal judgment enforced by lethal force. That judgment aligned closely with lived experience, but also set a precedent that frightened those committed to reform through peaceful means. And yet, it is impossible to separate the act from its consequences. After April 2nd, 1878, landlords across Ireland moderated their behavior, not because they had grown compassionate, but because they recognized vulnerability. Reform accelerated. Dialogue replaced decree. Fear shifted direction. These changes were driven by many forces, but Donegal lingered in the background as a reminder of what neglect and abuse could provoke. In this sense, the assassination functioned less as an end than as a catalyst. It did not resolve injustice, but it disrupted complacency. It forced acknowledgement of suffering that had been systematically ignored. It demonstrated that oppression carried risks not only for the oppressed, but for those who imposed it. William Sydney Clements remains a controversial figure because his life and death expose uncomfortable truths about power. He was not a monster in isolation. He was a product of a system that rewarded domination and insulated privilege from accountability. That system allowed him to act with impunity for decades. When accountability finally arrived, it did so outside the structures designed to deliver it. The road at Cratlack would look ordinary today. Grass grows along the stone walls. Birds nest in the trees overhead. Travelers pass without noticing anything remarkable. There is no marker, no plaque, no sign announcing what occurred there. Memory survives not through monuments, but through stories carried forward deliberately and selectively. The people of Donegal did not celebrate violence for its own sake. They celebrated an end to terror, however imperfectly achieved. Their silence afterward was not apathy. It was a statement that the moral ledger in their eyes had been balanced as far as it ever could be. History rarely offers neat conclusions. The assassination of the Earl of Leitrim sits at the intersection of justice and law, vengeance and resistance, memory and forgetting. It challenges the assumption that authority is self-justifying, and it warns that suffering ignored does not dissipate. It accumulates. In the end, what endures is not the manner of the Earl's death, but the reason it was accepted. A society had reached a point where formal institutions no longer functioned as instruments of fairness. When that happens, people create their own answers, however dangerous and final they may be. The story of April 2nd, 1878, is therefore not only about a man killed on a country road. It is about the consequences of absolute power exercised without conscience. It is about the fragile line between order and legitimacy. And it is about a community that, when pushed beyond endurance, chose silence over submission.